Hey everyone, welcome back. Some cases they just stick with you. They get under your skin, and the Delphi murders are definitely one of those. The mystery, the whispers, that video, the years of waiting for answers. It's gripped so many of us, and now finally we have a verdict.
It really has. It's a case that has gripped the nation for years, a puzzle everyone's been trying to put together. And this verdict, well, it might give some relief, but it opens up a whole new set of questions.
It does, yeah. So let's dive into this, starting with the big news presentation. Richard Allen, the man who worked at that CVS in Delphi, has been found guilty on all counts. 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of murder while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping.
A guilty verdict that carries with it a very heavy potential sentence, up to 130 years in prison, with the actual sentencing set for December 20th. Outside the courthouse, the sense of relief was palpable, people cheering, crying, hugging. And on social media, Libby German's sister, Kelsey, posted, "Nearly 8 years. Today was the day." Powerful words.
They are, yeah. It really highlights just the long wait for justice, the weight that those families have been carrying. But even amidst that relief, Alan's wife has said this isn't over. So it sounds like appeals are probably on the horizon, which means this story, who knows, it might have more twists and turns in store.
Absolutely. To understand where we are now, let's rewind back to the very beginning, February 13th, 2017, when Abby Williams and Libby German disappeared while they were hiking near the Monon High Bridge. Their bodies were tragically found the next day.
Right, and that haunting bridge guy video, you remember that? The grainy footage, the audio of someone saying, "guys down the hill." That became a crucial piece of this whole puzzle. But even with those composite sketches that were released, the case just went cold for years, 5 years to be exact. And it wasn't until October 2022 that Richard Allen, seemingly out of the blue, was arrested.
5 years of dead ends, and then this local man working at the CVS becomes the center of it all. It's almost unbelievable.
Yeah, talk about a bombshell. And the trial itself was just a whirlwind. There were delays, leaked evidence, even a fight over Allen's legal representation. Like, it had all the drama of a true crime documentary. But when the dust settled, it really came down to the evidence. What did the prosecution present to convince that jury that Allen was guilty?
Well, there was a combination of factors. First, you have Allen's own admission that he was on the trail that day, a detail that for some reason wasn't properly investigated for years. Then there were those eyewitness accounts of Bridge Guy that didn't really match Allen's description.
And what about that surveillance footage? I remember hearing they had video of his car near the trail, but it wasn't definitive proof, right?
That's right. The footage showed Allen's car in the vicinity, but the exact road it took wasn't clear. So it placed him in the area, but not definitively at the crime scene. Then there was the physical evidence. An unspent .40 caliber bullet was found near the bodies. Ballistics analysis linked it to Allen's gun.
But didn't the defense challenge how reliable that analysis was? Something about tool mark matching. I remember that being a big point of contention.
They did. For those who aren't familiar, tool mark matching is kind of like fingerprinting for guns. The idea is that each firearm leaves unique marks on bullets and casings when fired. But the defense argued that this type of analysis isn't as reliable as other forensic methods like DNA testing. And speaking of DNA, there was no DNA evidence linking Allen to the crime scene.
So it seems like the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, a collection of details rather than that smoking gun. But what about the defense? What was their strategy?
Well, they painted a very different picture of Richard Allen. They focused on his mental state, presenting him as a man in crisis, potentially suffering from a very severe mental breakdown.
This is where those confessions come in, right? The ones he reportedly made to prison guards, the warden, even a psychologist while he was in solitary confinement. Those confessions were pretty detailed and disturbing, if I remember correctly.
They were. Allen described things like slashing the girls' throats, placing branches over their bodies, even a plan to rape the girls that he abandoned because a van drove by. Chilling stuff. But the defense argued that these confessions were coerced, a product of Allen's deteriorating mental state brought on by that prolonged solitary confinement.
Now, I've heard about the harsh conditions of solitary confinement. Didn't the defense present evidence of how it can impact someone psychologically?
They did. They actually showed the jury video footage of Allen in his cell naked, banging his head against the wall, exhibiting really disturbing behavior. And they argued that this was a man pushed to the brink, suffering from psychosis. And they brought in expert witnesses to testify about those devastating psychological effects of solitary confinement, especially on someone with pre-existing mental health issues. It was a powerful counter-narrative to the prosecution's portrayal of Allen as a cold-blooded killer.
So you have these gruesome confessions on the one hand, and then you have this image of a mentally fragile man on the other. Seems like a lot for the jury to weigh. How did they even begin to sort through all of that?
It was a complex case, for sure, and the jury deliberations weren't easy either. There were reports that they sent a note to the judge asking for clarification on certain legal definitions, which suggests that they were really grappling with the nuances of the case. And remember, even with this guilty verdict, there are still a lot of unanswered questions.
Like the big one, why? Why these two girls? Why did this happen? It seems like the trial, even with that mountain of evidence and arguments, just couldn't fully answer that.
It's a question that continues to haunt this case. The prosecution presented a lot of evidence linking Allen to the crime, but they never established a clear motive. And that lack of a why, that sense of randomness, it makes the whole thing even more unsettling, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And I remember hearing something about the defense wanting to introduce a theory about a white nationalist group, potentially connecting the murders to some kind of ritualistic killing.
That's right. But the judge ultimately disallowed that line of argument, citing lack of evidence. So while the defense tried to offer alternative explanations, the prosecution's case, with its focus on the physical and circumstantial evidence, ultimately prevailed.
Okay, so we've got the verdict, but there are still pieces of the puzzle that don't quite fit. What about that detail I read about Libby's phone? Apparently, it had headphones or an O cable plugged in after Allen would have supposedly left the trail. Could that mean that someone else was involved, maybe an accomplice?
That's one of those loose ends that's hard to ignore. The prosecution downplayed its significance, but it certainly adds another layer of mystery to this whole case. It's the kind of detail that keeps people speculating, wondering if there's more to the story than we know.
It feels like even with a guilty verdict, the story just isn't truly over. There's that sense of unfinished business, a feeling that we might not have all the answers yet.
Exactly. And then you have Alan's wife stating that this isn't over at all, which suggests appeals are likely. So even with the trial concluded, it seems like this saga might just be entering a new chapter.
It's a lot to take in, the verdict, the lingering questions, the potential for more legal battles ahead. What does all of this mean for the Delphi community? How do they move forward after something like this?
That's a question that's probably on everyone's mind in Delphi right now. How do you heal? How do you rebuild a sense of safety and trust when something so horrific has shattered your community?
And how do you reconcile the image of Richard Allen, the man who worked at the CVS, with the chilling crimes he's been convicted of? It's almost impossible to grasp.
It's a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that darkness can lurk in the most unexpected places. And it leaves us with a sense of unease, a feeling that even with the verdict, some questions may never be fully answered.
We'll be back in a moment to delve a little deeper into some of the most intriguing aspects of this case, starting with those confessions and the impact of solitary confinement. Stay with us. Those confessions that Richard Allen made, they really add another layer to this whole story. It's hard to imagine what would drive someone to confess to such horrific crimes, especially when, the defense is arguing that his mental state was so fragile.
It really is a fascinating psychological puzzle, yeah. On the one hand, you have these detailed confessions to prison guards, the wardens, even psychologists. Allen described the killings where he left the bodies, even that detail about a passing van that supposedly interrupted a more sinister plan.
Yeah, I remember reading about those details. Chilling stuff. But the idea that these confessions might have been coerced, a product of his mental state deteriorating under solitary confinement, it's tough to wrap your head around that.
It is. It really is. Think about it. Solitary confinement. It's designed to be isolating to break someone down. And in Allen's case, the defense argued that this isolation, combined with his existing mental health struggles, led to a form of psychosis, a break from reality. They claimed that he was so desperate for any kind of human contact,
Yeah.
for any kind of stimulation, that he confessed to things he didn't do.
It's disturbing to think that someone could be pushed to that point. And I remember those videos that the defense showed the jury, that footage of Allen alone in his cell, naked, banging his head against the wall. Those images were tough to watch, to say the least.
They were impactful, that's for sure. They gave the jury a visual representation of Allen's mental state, the distress that he was experiencing. And the defense brought in experts. They testified about the, well-documented psychological effects of solitary confinement, the anxiety, the paranoia, hallucinations, even self-harm.
It makes you wonder if someone is already vulnerable. Could that kind of isolation, could that actually push them to make false confessions? I mean, if they're that desperate for attention, for interaction, even, negative attention. Could that become a sort of coping mechanism? A twisted one, but still.
It's a question that has been debated for years in legal and psychological circles. The defense argued that, in Allen's case, the pressure of solitary confinement, the lack of stimulation, the constant surveillance all contributed to a false confession.
But there's also that confession to the psychologist, Dr. Monica Watla. And she wasn't a prison employee, right? She was brought in specifically to evaluate Alan's mental state.
That's correct. And it came out during the trial that Dr. Walla was actually a true crime enthusiast. She had been following the Delphi case closely, even participating in online forums that were dedicated to the investigation.
Wow, that adds another layer. Was she truly objective in her evaluation? Or did her personal interest in the case influence her interactions with Alan? I can only imagine the defense had a field day with that.
Oh, they did. They argued that Dr. Walla's personal interest in the case, coupled with her role as an authority figure, could have created a situation where Alan felt pressured to confess, even if the confession wasn't true.
So we have these conflicting narratives. The prosecution presenting the confessions as evidence of guilt, and then the defense arguing that they were coerced, unreliable. Due to Alan's mental state and the influence of that solitary confinement, it's a lot to unpack. It makes you wonder how the jurors were even able to make sense of it all.
You're right, it was a lot to process. And remember, during deliberations, the jury actually sent a note to the judge. They were asking for clarification on the legal definition of knowingly or intentionally, which suggests they were really wrestling with that question of Alan's mental state at the time of the murders, whether he was truly in control of his actions or acting under some form of duress.
That note from the jury really highlights the weight of their responsibility, the burden of deciding someone's fate based on sometimes, conflicting and confusing information. It's a heavy responsibility, no doubt.
It is, absolutely. And in a case like this, where you have these incredibly disturbing confessions, but also evidence that suggests this fragile mental state, the line between guilt and innocence, it can become very, very blurry.
And let's not forget that loose end we talked about earlier. The detail about Libby's phone having those headphones or that O cable plugged in after Alan supposedly left the trail, that still nags at me. Could it point to someone else being involved? Maybe an accomplice?
It's a detail that's hard to dismiss. The prosecution didn't offer a clear explanation for it. They focused on the evidence that they felt directly connected Alan to the scene. But it doesn't really erase the question of why Letty's phone would have been, manipulated after Alan was supposedly gone. It leaves this doubt, a sense that maybe we just don't have the full picture yet.
I keep coming back to that question of motive. Why? Why Abby and Libby? The prosecution presented a lot of evidence, but they never really established a clear reason why these two girls were targeted. And without that motive, it makes the whole thing feel even more random, more senseless.
You're right. The lack of a clear motive, it is one of the most disturbing aspects of this whole case. It leaves this void, this sense of unanswered questions. It can be very unsettling. It's the why that haunts us, the search for meaning in a seemingly meaningless act of violence.
And I remember reading about the defense's attempt to introduce that theory about a white nationalist group potentially being involved, suggesting that the murders were part of some kind of ritualistic killing. But that line of argument was shut down by the judge, right?
It was, yeah. The judge ruled that there wasn't sufficient evidence to support that theory, so it wasn't allowed to be presented to the jury. But even though it wasn't part of the official proceedings, that theory has lingered in the public consciousness, adding to the speculation and the unease around this case.
It's like this case casts a long shadow even with the verdict. We have a guilty man behind bars, but the ripple effects of this tragedy continue to spread, leaving behind a trail of questions, doubts, and anxieties.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the face of a legal resolution, there are wounds that run deep, questions that may never be fully answered, and a community left to grapple with the aftermath of a crime that shook them to their core.
And what about the families of Abby and Libby? What does this verdict mean for them? Is it a sense of closure? Or is it just another step in a long and painful journey?
That's a question that only they can answer. While a guilty verdict might bring a sense of justice being served, it can't bring back their daughters. It can't erase the trauma they've endured. Their journey toward healing, it will likely continue long after the legal proceedings have concluded.
It's a heartbreaking reality. This case has been so heavily focused on the legal proceedings, the evidence, the arguments, that it's easy to forget the human cost. The impact this tragedy has had on real people, on families, on a whole community.
It is. It's important to remember that at the heart of this story, beyond the headlines and the courtroom drama, There are two young lives that were tragically cut short, two families that are forever changed, and a community grappling with a loss that's impossible to measure.
We'll be back in just a bit to continue our deep dive into the Delphi murders case. We'll explore how this case captured the attention of the nation, the role of true crime communities, and the broader social implications of a story that has both captivated and horrified so many. It's tough to talk about the Delphi murders without, acknowledging the huge role that public interest played in keeping this story alive. I mean, for years, those online communities, they were buzzing with theories, people dissecting every little detail, trying to make sense of it all.
It's a phenomenon we see with so many of these high-profile crimes, this real explosion of interest in true crime. And the Delphi case, with that haunting video, those whispered words, the years without answers, it really captured people's imaginations.
It did, yeah. It felt like everyone had a theory, like everyone was trying to be an armchair detective. But it makes you wonder, what's the line between, genuine concern and maybe getting a little too caught up in the drama?
It's a valid question for sure. On the one hand, you have these online communities. They're dedicated to finding justice, keeping the pressure on law enforcement, supporting those families. And that can be a really powerful force for good. But there's the other side of that coin, the potential for things to go too far, for speculation to become harassment, for armchair detectives, to maybe even interfere with real investigations.
It's a fine line, isn't it? And I imagine for the people in Delphi, having their town become like the center of this national obsession, seeing their homes and faces all over the internet, it must have been so surreal, overwhelming at times, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to follow a case from afar, but to actually live in the community where it happened, to walk those same streets, to see those familiar faces, sure, it brings a whole other layer of complexity to it. And then you have that constant media attention, the pressure on law enforcement to solve the case, that fear that just lingers in the air.
It's a lot to carry, and I think for a lot of people, this case really tapped into some primal fears, especially for those of us who have kids. You see those images of Abby and Libby just out for a walk. It's a parent's worst nightmare.
It is. There's something about this case that just resonates with this deep-seated fear we have for our children's safety, the vulnerability that I think we all feel when we realize that bad things can happen, even in places that seem safe.
And for so many years, that fear was, made worse by that lack of answers. It felt like anyone could be a suspect, that danger was lurking around every corner. So now that we have this verdict, now that Richard Allen has been found guilty, does that bring a sense of closure, or does it just shift the focus to this next chapter, to the appeals, the potential for more twists and turns in this whole saga?
It's complicated, I think. For some, the verdict will probably provide a sense of relief, the sense of justice being served. But for others, those lingering questions, the loose ends, the lack of a clear motive, it might be hard to really feel like the story's over.
And for the families, of course, the pain of their loss is something that will never truly go away, regardless of what happens in the courts.
It won't. This verdict, while it's significant, it can't bring back their daughters. It can't erase the trauma they've experienced. Their journey toward healing will likely continue long after the legal proceedings are over.
It's a sad truth, isn't it? Sometimes even when you get a guilty verdict, there's no real closure, just a profound sense of loss and a lingering unease that settles over everything.
As you reflect on what we've talked about today, about the evidence, the arguments, the psychology, the impact on the community, think about this. What does justice truly mean in a case like this? Is it just about punishment? Or is it something more? Something that acknowledges those complexities of human behavior, the limitations of our justice system, and that enduring impact of this tragedy on individuals and on communities?
We've covered a lot of ground today. We really dove deep into this case that's gripped the nation for years. But ultimately, it's up to each of us to wrestle with those complexities, to try and make sense of the senseless, and to find our own answers to those haunting questions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Delphi murders verdict.